The assignment came through on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays were the day the compact's administrative machinery processed its lesser business. Routing corrections, filing backlogs, personnel adjustments that didn't rate a Monday or a Friday. My transfer to the Velthoran Women's Welfare and Transit Compound at Kethsoval Border Station arrived between a directive about recalibrating cargo manifests and a reminder that Level 3 access badges required renewal every 18 months. I was, in the bureaucratic language of the transfer notice, being redeployed to meet unit staffing shortfalls in a critical welfare processing function. In the language everyone in the compact coordination wing used when they said it to my face, I was being sent to the women's compound because I had filed 4 consecutive accuracy challenges against Senior Coordinator Vethoral's quarterly reports and been right about all 4 of them, and Vethoral had sufficient seniority to make Tuesdays complicated. I packed what I needed, which wasn't much. 14 years of compact coordination work had taught me that most of what people carry between postings is weight they don't examine. I took my 2 reference binders, my personal terminal, a change of clothes, and the small framed notation chart that my first supervisor had given me when I passed my coordination certification. She had written in the margin in her particular slanted hand, "Read everything, not just the parts that look relevant." I had taken her at her word for 14 years. It had not made me popular with Vethoral, but it had made me accurate, and accuracy was what I had instead of political instincts. Kethsoval was a border station, one of the administrative processing nodes that the compact maintained along the Velthoran transit corridors. It processed inbound transit documentation, welfare classifications, and resettlement support for Velthoran nationals moving between house territories and compact-administered zones. The main coordination center occupied the upper 2 levels of the station's north wing. The Women's Welfare and Transit Compound occupied a set of repurposed freight offices on the station's east side, accessed through a corridor that someone had painted a color I could not identify. Not quite gray, not quite green. A color that communicated without text that nothing important happened here. I reported on a Wednesday morning to a unit supervisor named Kaelvorn Seth, who was Velthoran, somewhere in her early 50s, and who looked at my transfer, noticed the way experienced people look at things they have seen before and would prefer not to see again. "You're the 4th, she said. "The 4th coordinator. The 4th coordinator they've sent us as a disciplinary measure." She set the notice on her desk. The previous 3 spent between 2 and 6 weeks reading personal correspondence and waiting to be transferred back. We are, in the estimation of the Compact Coordination Center, a unit that processes routine welfare documentation for women and dependents who do not rate priority handling. She said this with the flat precision of someone reciting a fact they disagree with but have stopped arguing about. "I expect you'll find it quiet." I looked at the stack of intake ledgers on the shelf behind her. There were 11 of them, and the most recent bore a date stamp that suggested it had not been fully reviewed in 7 months. "I'll need to read those," I said. Kaelvorn Seth looked at the ledgers. She looked at me. She said, "All right," in the tone of someone who did not expect it to mean anything, but was willing to wait and find out. She showed me to my space, a repurposed intake counter in a side office off the main corridor, with a chair and a terminal and a wall that had no mounting hardware on it, which told me the previous 3 coordinators had not bothered to make the place theirs. I mounted the framed notation chart at eye level, aligned it carefully, and then carried the first ledger back from Kaelvorn Seth's shelf and sat down. The compound's common area was a long rectangular room that had once been a freight sorting floor. Someone had installed partitions and a food preparation station and a cluster of low tables, and the overall effect was functional without being comfortable. When I walked through it that first morning, 10 Velthoran women stopped what they were doing and looked at me with the particular expression that people develop when they have learned to be careful about what they expect from a situation. Velthoran women were built tall and angular, with the ridge-line facial structure that distinguished the various houses by shade and pattern. The women in this compound had the slightly worn quality of long-term transit residents, people who had packed for a short stay, and found themselves months or years into waiting for a process to resolve. Their clothing was maintained carefully, which I had come to understand was a form of dignity kept intact when other forms were not available. Their children, small ones and older ones, occupying corners and corridor spaces with the adapted quietness of children who had learned that adults were busy with paperwork, watched me with a more direct curiosity than the adults. I found my office, and I began reading the intake ledgers from the beginning. The ledgers were detailed. Kaelvorn Seth's unit had maintained its documentation with a precision that spoke well of the supervisor, and said something about the kind of careful attention paid when the people doing the recording know that the records are the only reliable advocates for the people they describe. The entries were thorough and cross-referenced and written in the notation style that told me someone had read the procedural guidelines before filling them in. What they revealed, across 11 ledgers and somewhere north of 3 years of accumulated case histories, was a pattern I would not have seen if I had been reading only the parts that seemed immediately relevant. I was on the 4th ledger, 2 hours after lunch, when the child came in. She was small, copper-gold skin, silver eyes with the slight vertical extension that was common in the border house lineage. She wore a transit-stay coverall that had been hemmed to fit her, badly but practically, the hemming of someone who had run out of alternatives rather than patience, and she was carrying a piece of posted notice that she had removed from the corridor board. She stood in my doorway in the particular stance of a child who has been taught to assess before entering, and then she said, "There is a word on this I cannot find in the definition board." She held out the notice. It was a compact administrative update, the kind that gets posted routinely and routinely ignored, and the word she could not find was jurisdictional, which was not in the definition board because the definition board had not been updated since before the most recent procedural revision. "It means it relates to which authority has the power to make a decision," I said. "In this case, which office has the right to process a particular type of document." She considered this with the focused attention of a child taking a measurement. "The office that processed our documents does not have that right anymore." I looked at the notice more carefully. It was an update about a jurisdictional transfer, a periodic reorganization where a processing function had moved between compact departments. The update was 8 months old. I had not seen it cross-referenced anywhere in the intake ledgers. "What is your name?" I said. "Ale." "And your mother is resident in this compound?" "Yes. Her transit instrument has been held for processing for 4 months. She said it without complaint in the Register of Observed Fact. She files inquiries every 11 days. The replies say the instrument is in active review." I looked at the notice in my hand. I looked at the ledger open on my desk. The jurisdictional update had transferred processing authority for a specific category of transit instruments, those held under the Velthoran Secondary House classification, from the Compact Central Welfare Office to the Border Coordination Unit. The transfer had happened 8 months ago. The Border Coordination Unit at Kethsovel was understaffed and had not received any formal notification that they now held processing authority for this category. The previous 3 coordinators apparently had not connected the update to the ledger categories. The result was that every transit instrument in the compound held under the secondary house classification was sitting in a processing queue at an office that no longer had the authority to process it, waiting for a review that would never be completed because the reviewing office had transferred the function without transferring the pending cases. "Thank you for bringing this to me," I said, and I meant it, and I could tell from the slight adjustment in her expression that this was not the response she had been prepared for. She left. I read the notice 3 more times, then I began reading the ledgers differently. I counted the affected instruments twice to make sure I had it right. 23. The oldest had been waiting for 4 years. I sat with that for a long moment. 4 years was not a clerical gap. 4 years was a life lived in transit accommodation, in a compound designed for short stays, with a child who had learned to hem her own coveralls, because waiting required practical solutions, and the waiting had gone on long enough that the practical solutions had become permanent. I closed the ledger. I opened my reference binders to the procedural section on jurisdictional corrections, a mechanism I had used twice in 14 years, both times at postings where the other coordinators had told me it probably wasn't worth the administrative effort, and I began drafting. Seth found me at 7:30. The compound was quiet by then, the panels on their lower setting, the common area still. "You're still here," she said. "I found something." I showed her the jurisdictional update, the cross-reference to the secondary house classification category, and the list of 23 transit instruments. I walked her through the processing gap. Which office held the authority now? Which office still held the cases? What the jurisdictional correction mechanism required, and what the expected timeline was if the correction was filed correctly, and the border coordination unit processed it without raising a secondary objection. She read everything I put in front of her. She did not ask me to summarize. She did not ask me whether I was sure. She read it the way Seth read everything, which was completely. When she finished, she said, "The previous 3 coordinators didn't find it." You wouldn't find it unless you read the jurisdictional update against the ledger categories. The connection isn't obvious. Ale brought you the notice. She found a word she couldn't parse on the definition board. She brought it to me. Seth was quiet for a moment. In the corridor outside my office, something shifted, a small sound, barely a sound at all. I glanced at the doorway and saw, very briefly, the edge of a copper-gold profile. Ale in the corridor, listening. She was too disciplined to have been there long, but she had been there long enough. I looked back at Seth and said nothing about it. "File the correction," she said. "Whatever you need from me, you have it. Your counter-signature and a letter to the border coordination unit confirming the compound's case load. I'll have the submission ready before morning. I'll have them ready before you are." I worked until 9 and then went to my quarters and slept. At 6 the next morning I was back at my desk. By the time Seth arrived with her counter-signature at 7, the submission was drafted, indexed, and tabbed. I do not think she had expected that either. The intake officer at the border coordination unit, a young compact administrator named Doval, who had the slightly stunned quality of someone receiving a document they were not prepared for, read through the submission twice and looked at me. "This covers 23 cases." "Yes. Some of these have been in hold for years. The oldest is 4 years and 2 months. He looked at the submission again. He had the expression of someone calculating what this meant for his unit's workflow, and simultaneously recognizing that the calculation was secondary to the content. He said he would need supervisor authorization for the older cases, which was procedurally correct, and I told him the correction filing should trigger automatic case transfer within 48 hours once his supervisor reviewed it, and I gave him my contact information at the compound in case there were questions. He wrote it down with the focused attention of someone who wanted to be sure he could find me when he understood what he was holding. The word moved through the compound by the afternoon. By some mechanism I did not entirely understand. A word exchanged in the food preparation area, a sentence at the common table, the particular quality of how Seth's expression shifted when she told someone what I had found. The women knew that something had changed. They watched me with a different quality of attention than they had in the morning. Several of them had questions, delivered initially through Cale Vorn Seth as a practical formality that I understood was not coldness but prudence. What was the timeline for case transfer? What happened if the Border Coordination Unit raised a procedural objection? Was there a secondary correction mechanism if the first filing was rejected on a technical ground? I answered each question fully without simplifying. By the third question, Cale Vorn Seth had stepped back from the intermediary role, and the women were asking me directly. I noticed this, and I noticed that she had noticed it, and we both let it continue. The women's questions were precise. They had been living with these instruments for months and years, and they had learned the procedural language the way people learn a language they need, thoroughly, out of necessity, with particular attention to the parts that had already cost them something. When they asked about secondary objection mechanisms, they were not asking in the abstract. They were asking about the specific mechanism they had already encountered, or the specific timeline they had already outlived, or the specific form language that had appeared in a rejection, and that they wanted to understand before it appeared in another one. I understood things about the compound by the end of the first week that I had not understood at the beginning, and most of what I understood came from these conversations. The women were not waiting passively. They had been working the procedural system with the tools available to them, which were limited, and filing inquiries on schedules and reading every posted notice. And the reason the instruments had not cleared was not because anyone had failed to try. The reason was a gap in institutional process that nobody with the right reference binders and the right habit of reading had ever sat down in this office long enough to find. There was also, I came to understand, a second reason. The compound was classified in the Compact's administrative taxonomy as a secondary welfare facility, a designation that determined how quickly inquiries were returned, how often coordination staff were assigned, and how those staff were evaluated. A secondary welfare facility was not expected to generate complex procedural work. It was expected to process routine documentation and route questions to the primary offices that would handle the difficult cases. The taxonomy assumed that the difficult cases were elsewhere. The taxonomy was wrong, and it had been wrong for long enough that the assumption had calcified into policy, and the policy had calcified into the color of the corridor and the quality of the coordinators sent to staff it. Ale came back on the third day. She came in the morning, which was different from the afternoon visit I had half expected, and she sat in the corner chair, the one at an angle to my desk, the position that indicated she intended to stay, and she asked what a case transfer timeline meant and whether the timeline applied the same way to cases with amended house designations. Her mother's case had 2 house designation amendments. Ale had read the original instrument documents. I explained the timeline and the amendment question. She asked about classification confirmation requests and whether they were separate from jurisdictional corrections. I showed her the relevant procedural section. She read it the way she read the jurisdictional update and the corridor notices, and I was beginning to understand everything completely, looking for the implications, not just the surface instruction. You would file the classification confirmation if it came to that, she said. If it becomes necessary, yes. She considered this. My mother says coordinators who are sent here usually leave quickly. I know. She says the ledgers haven't been reviewed properly in 7 months. She could tell from the inquiry responses. Ale looked at me with the level attention of someone who has decided to ask the direct version. You read the whole ledgers. All of them. Even the parts that look unimportant. Especially those. She nodded, with the small, precise nod of someone confirming a result. Then she picked up a notation reference sheet from the edge of my desk, one I had been using to cross-reference the procedural classification codes, and began reading it. I let her read it. The office was quiet. Outside in the corridor, 2 of the younger children were playing some game that involved the careful arrangement of small flat stones on a window ledge and the deliberate removal of one. The afternoon panels, when I eventually noticed what time it was, had shifted to their lower angle. She asked 4 more questions before she left. All of them were good ones. The border coordination unit took 11 days to complete the case transfer and begin processing. Their supervisor, a Velthoran woman named Dovketh Sorn, who arrived at the compound on day 5 with specific documentation questions, and the manner of someone who had read everything before coming, met with Kale Vorn Seth and me for 2 hours. She asked precise questions and received precise answers, and at the end of the meeting said that processing would be prioritized for the cases with the longest hold periods, which was the correct decision, and that the expected timeline for initial reviews was 14 working days from case transfer. 14 days was not a short time for the people waiting. For the woman whose instrument had been held for 4 years, 14 days was, I suspected, comprehensible in a way that 4 years no longer was. I watched Kale Vorn Seth communicate the timeline to the compound's residents that evening, and I watched the particular quality of stillness that moved through them. Not relief, because bureaucratic processes had disappointed them before, but the specific stillness of people who have been told that the mechanism is now correctly oriented and are holding themselves carefully against the weight of that. I went back to the ledgers. There were smaller corrections needed throughout. Not another jurisdictional gap of that scale, but filing discrepancies. Classification codes entered against a coding standard that had been revised without the revision reaching the compound case references that had drifted from the active tracking system through the normal entropy of 7 months without a thorough review. I worked through them in order, one at a time, doing the kind of accumulative work that does not feel significant on any given day and adds up to something real by the end of a month. Each correction was small. Each one was accurate. The compound's documentation, when the secondary review was complete, would reflect what was actually true about the people it described, rather than what had been true at the time of the last careful reading. That mattered. A record that accurately describes a person's situation is the minimum that a person is owed by the system that holds their case, and it is not always the minimum they receive. The dynamic in the compound shifted in ways that were real but difficult to name precisely. The women did not become warm in a way that I would have called forward. They were not a group that moved quickly toward gestures, and they had learned caution in a compound that had disappointed them before. And caution learned from experience is not something that dissolves because one correct thing has been done. But they stopped treating my presence as an imposition to be waited out, and started treating it as a functional fact to be incorporated. I was asked questions. I was included in the coordination meetings. When decisions needed to be made about how to present documentation to the border coordination unit or how to structure an inquiry to the Central Welfare Office, Kale Vorn Seth consulted me before deciding rather than after, which was the functional difference between being useful and being there. The children were less careful. Children who have been in transit accommodation long enough develop a practical orientation toward the adults in their environment. They assess quickly whether an adult is functional. They adapt to functional adults faster than to non-functional ones, and they waste very little time on the diplomatic distance that adults maintain by default. The small ones had been watching from the first day. By the end of the second week, proximity was no longer a decision. They occupied the spaces around my desk during the common hours the way children occupy spaces that have become ordinary to them, which was, I found, a straightforwardly good thing to be in the vicinity of. The 10-year-old boy who practiced the formal address. His name was Karath, and his mother had been in the compound for 18 months, and he had been reading the administrative notices with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand the system that was governing his life, started bringing me discrepancies he found in the posted materials. He was not always right about the discrepancy, but his reasoning was usually sound, and when I explained where he had the cross-reference wrong, He did not require the explanation more than once. He had the particular quality of a child who treats being wrong as information rather than a verdict, which is the quality that eventually makes someone accurate. His mother, Sevorn Dale, told me in the third week that he had decided he wanted to work in administration. I told him, the next time he came by, that the procedural classification index was on the second shelf, and he could read it whenever he wanted to. He read 40 pages of it that afternoon in the corner that had become, by some unspoken compound consensus, a space where children who were reading things seriously were not interrupted. Ale came every afternoon. She had a small notebook, her own, not compound issue, in which she maintained a notation system that was hers and not the index's. She cross-referenced procedural sections with case examples she had abstracted from overheard conversations in the compound, and she annotated the cross-references with her own questions, which she then brought to me in order. She was building something I recognized, because I had built it myself at 22 sitting in my first posting with the framed chart on the wall. The working knowledge of how a system actually functions rather than how it appears to function, assembled piece by piece, from reading and questioning, and the willingness to hold an incomplete understanding until the next correct piece could be added. Her mother came to me on the 14th day. Railvorn Ale was a quiet woman with copper-gold skin and silver, eyes a shade darker than her daughter's, and she had the contained quality of someone who had been managing difficult circumstances without complaint for long enough that the containment had become structural. She stood in my doorway in the way her daughter did not, the doorway pause of a person who was deciding whether the approach was appropriate, and then she said, "My instrument cleared this afternoon." I saw the notification. The classification confirmation wasn't triggered, the amendment sequence read correctly. There were 2 other instruments that cleared with it, from families who have been waiting longer than we have. The prioritization was correct. Railvorn Ale was quiet for a moment in the way of someone sorting through things she might say. Then, Ale tells me you explain everything to her, the full version. She asks for the full version. She told me. Something shifted in her expression, the exact quality of a calculation being revised. She also told me you read the entire ledgers, not summaries, the actual ledgers. That's the work. It wasn't the work the previous coordinators did. I didn't have a useful answer to that. The gap between what the work was and what it had been performed as was sitting in the cleared instruments, and the 4 years of compound residence the oldest case had cost. I said, "I'm sorry it took this long," which was true and not enough. She nodded in the manner of someone accepting something accurate. Then, "My daughter wants to work in administration. She's been saying so for 3 months. I told her she should speak with you about it." A pause. "I am giving you that message. Tell her to come in the morning. I have a procedural certification index she might find useful." Railvorn Ale looked at me for another moment, the level look of a woman completing an assessment, and then said, "Good night, coordinator," and returned to the corridor. I heard Ale's voice somewhere in the direction of the common room asking a question, and I could not make out the full answer, but it had the quality of something resolved. On the 23rd day, the last of the 23 transit instruments cleared. I know the exact day because I was tracking them. There was a notation sheet on my wall beside the framed chart, the practical accounting I used in any multi-case correction chain, and I had marked each clearance as it came through. The 23rd mark was for Sevcoral Davin, who had been in the compound for 4 years and 2 months, and whose daughter Nail was 7 years old, and had therefore spent more than half of her life in a transit compound, and who had silver hair and the precise, contained quality of a child who has adapted thoroughly to waiting without allowing the waiting to touch the core of what she was. The clearance came through at 8 in the morning, before the compound was fully awake. I walked to Sevcoral Davin's unit in the east wing and knocked. She opened the door. She had not been told yet. She looked at me with the particular care of 4 years of careful waiting, the expression of someone who has learned to receive news neutrally before they know what kind it is. I said, "Your transit instrument cleared at 7:30 this morning." Sevcoral Davin was not a woman who moved quickly to expressions. She had trained herself out of it, I suspected, because the cost of expectations formed too quickly had been high. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked past me, as if checking that I was alone and could not therefore be a delegation bringing a different message. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed behind her. Her hands went to her lap. She looked at the floor. It wasn't dramatic. It was the movement of a person setting down something very heavy, carefully, because they have been carrying it for so long they are no longer certain what their body will do without the weight. Her daughter Nail came out of the back of the unit, silver-haired and not quite awake, and came to stand beside her mother and put a hand on her arm without asking why. Just a hand, the instinct of a child who does not need the reason. I gave Sevcoral Davin the clearance documentation and went back to my desk. By mid-morning, the word had moved through the compound in the way words do when they carry a weight people have been holding in trust. The common area, when I walked through for my second cup of tea, was fuller than usual, and the quality of the room was different, not louder, but looser, the sound of a held breath released by degrees across 30 or 40 people who had been watching one another wait. Several women nodded to me as I passed. Kareth said "coordinator" in the formal register, practicing, and I returned "good morning," and he was satisfied. 2 of the younger children followed me back toward my office at a distance that communicated interest without commitment, which was about right for where we were in the process of becoming ordinary to each other. Ale was in the corner chair when I arrived, the certification index open on the edge of the desk at the classification appeal section, which she had told me she was saving because it was the most complex part, and she wanted to be ready for it. She looked up. Nail's instrument cleared. "Yes." Nail told me. "She's been here 4 years. Nail has." She paused, correcting herself for precision. "Nail has been here 4 years. Her mother has also been here 4 years. But what I mean is that Nail has never been anywhere else." "I know." Ale looked at the certification index, then at me. "When I work in administration," she said, "I'm going to read the whole ledger. That's the correct approach." She considered this for a moment with the gravity of someone formalizing a principle. "You should put that in writing somewhere official," she said, "so other coordinators know. The whole ledger, including the parts that look unimportant, because those are sometimes the most important parts. I'll include it in my posting report." This satisfied her. She turned back to the classification appeal section, and I turned back to the procedural update I was cross-referencing. The office was quiet in the way it had become quiet, the shared quiet of 2 people doing adjacent work in the same space, which is a different quality of quiet from the kind that means nothing is happening. The Queen's welfare inspector arrived on the 31st day. Her name was Dav Sorn Kale, and she held the rank of senior inspector under the Velthorin Royal Welfare Oversight Compact, a joint treaty body with authority to assess compact-administered facilities serving Velthorin nationals. The inspection had been scheduled for months, a routine audit on the rolling calendar that applied to all qualifying facilities. Kaelvorn Seth had mentioned it at the end of our first week. I had asked what the protocol was for coordination staff during inspections, and she had told me that the previous 3 coordinators had found reasons to be absent, which told me what I needed to know. I was at my desk on the 31st day, working through a secondary cross-reference in the ledger corrections, when the quality of the compound's common area shifted in the particular way that spaces shift when someone with institutional authority enters them. I stayed at my desk. Cross-references do not improve from being abandoned mid-chain. Inspector Davsorn Kale came to my office 20 minutes later. She was Velthorin tall, with the dark ridgelines of the central house lineage, and she carried her inspection documentation with the ease of someone who had been doing this long enough that the administrative weight of it had become ordinary. She looked at my office, the notation chart on the wall, the ledgers stacked in order on the shelf I had organized by date, the clearance tracking sheet with 23 marks beside the framed chart, and she read the margin notation on the framed chart. "Read everything," she said. "Not just the parts that look relevant. Your supervisor. First one. 14 years ago. Inspector Davsorn Kale set her documentation on the corner of my desk, an informal move for a formal inspection, and she looked at me with the assessment quality of someone who reads people the way I read ledgers. "The jurisdictional correction," she said. "Filed on day 3, 23 cases, the last cleared 5 days ago." I saw the processing reports from the Border Coordination Unit. She looked at the clearance sheet. I also reviewed the individual case histories. Sev Coral Davin. 4 years and 2 months. Yes. A pause. I have conducted 11 routine audits of this compound over the past 4 years. Each time I have filed a finding that the coordination function was not being executed to standard. Each time the Compact Coordination Center has acknowledged the finding and sent another coordinator. She said it without inflection. "You are the 4th. "I know. How did you come to be here?" "Disciplinary transfer. I filed 4 accuracy challenges against my supervising coordinator's quarterly reports." She looked at me with an expression that was very precisely controlled and contained something behind the control. "You were sent here as a penalty." "Yes." She looked through my office doorway at the common area, where at that moment Sev Coral Davin and 2 other women were at one of the low tables with their children, and the room had the quality it had held since the 23rd clearance, not celebration, which would have been too large a claim on something still being confirmed by daily living, but a looser quality, the quality of a space from which a long-held weight had been removed. "Coordinator Don," she said, "I am going to file my inspection report today. In it I will note the jurisdictional correction, the 23 case clearances, and the additional ledger corrections you have implemented across the past 31 days. I will also file a separate recommendation to the Queen's Welfare Office that this posting be reclassified from a standard coordination function to a senior coordination function, with the credential elevation that designation carries. That recommendation takes time to process." "I understand." I will also note, in the section of my report that addresses compact personnel performance, that a coordinator assigned here as a disciplinary measure did more for the compound's residents in 31 days than 4 inspections and 3 prior coordinators accomplished in 4 years. She paused. "That notation goes into the compact's formal personnel record, not only the inspection file." I did not have a response to that. She had not delivered it as something that required one. "One more matter," she said. "Yes." "The child Ale. Kale Vorn Seth told me she has been in your office every afternoon for 3 weeks. She's been working through the procedural certification index. She has a good systematic approach and she asks the right questions. She is the daughter of Railvorn Ale, whose instrument cleared in the first processing batch." "Yes." "The Velthorin administrative career stream opens at formal assessment at 14. I have the authority to register preliminary aptitude notations for candidates who show early development. The notation goes into the candidate's record and is considered at the formal assessment stage." She looked at me with the specific attention of someone verifying a judgment before acting on it. "With the mother's consent, I could register such a notation for Ale today, if you believe it's warranted." I thought about the certification index with Ale's own notation system marked through it in 17 places. I thought about the word on the corridor board that she could not find on the definition board, and the question she had asked about the office that processed their documents, and the way she had read the procedural section I showed her, not to finish it, but to understand it. I thought about the classification appeal section she was saving for last, because she wanted to be ready. "It's warranted," I said. Davsorn Kale made the notation. "I'll speak with her mother." She conducted the rest of the audit with thorough efficiency, and by the mid-afternoon she was making preparations to leave. I was back at the cross-reference I had abandoned when Kale Vorn Seth appeared in my doorway. "She wants to speak with the compound before she leaves," Kale Vorn Seth said. "She's asked that you be present." The common area had filled. All of the adult residents were there, and most of the older children. The younger ones had arranged themselves in the manner of children who know an occasion is happening and have decided to be quiet on their own terms. Sevcoral Davin was there with Nail, who stood with her hand still in her mother's hand. She had been doing this, I had noticed, since the morning the instrument cleared, as if proximity was something she was no longer taking as settled, and was watching everything with the attention of someone who intended to remember the day accurately. Ale was at the edge of the group near the doorway in her assessment position. When she saw me she shifted, not to make room exactly, but to include me in the space she occupied. It was a precise shift. She had done it deliberately. Inspector Davsorn Kale addressed the compound in formal Velthoran, and in the compact standard register, and Kale Vorn Seth translated the portions where the compound's residents needed it. The inspector spoke about the audit findings. She spoke about the jurisdictional correction and the case clearances and what they meant in procedural terms going forward. She spoke about the reclassification recommendation and what it would mean for the compound's resources once it processed. She spoke about the preliminary aptitude notation she had registered for one of the compound's children, without naming Ale, in the language of the formal process, which meant that every parent in the room with a child of certain age looked at their child and then looked at each other. She spoke clearly, and she included everything the compound needed to understand their own situation, and she did not simplify or condense. I could see in the quality of the silence that this, too, was different, that being addressed as people to whom information belonged was not a thing this compound had experienced uniformly in the years before. Then she said something in Velthoran, a sentence I did not fully catch, and the room was still for a moment. Kale Vorn Seth translated it in a voice that was doing something careful with its register, and what it meant was, the improvement in this compound began with a coordinator who read the intake ledgers all the way through, because there was a child in the corridor who found a word she could not parse, and she brought it to him, and he read it. The room did not erupt. These were not people who erupted. There was a quality of attention that moved, the particular shift of a room of people who have been managing their expectations for a long time, making a small and considered adjustment. Several of them looked at me. Then more of them did, because in a room of that size, the drift of attention is a natural thing. I had been looked at before, in 14 years of postings, in the way that people look at a coordinator who has done something useful. This was different. This was the attention of a room full of people who had been waiting in a compound that treated them as minor business, who had filed inquiries every 11 days, and read the corridor notices, and maintained their records with a precision that was the only form of advocacy available to them, who had learned to be very careful about what they expected, and who were now making a decision about what to do with something they had not been prepared for. Sevcoral Davin crossed the room. She did not speak. She came and stood in front of me, and she took my hands, both of them, in the Velthoran formal grip, the debt acknowledgement, the one that is not a courtesy gesture but means something specific about what is owed and who holds the understanding of it. She held them. Her daughter Nail, at her side, pressed her small silver-haired head briefly against my arm. Not a hug, not entirely, the gesture of a child who has learned to keep her feeling compact, making it a degree larger for exactly this moment, exactly this once. I did not know what to say, and nothing I might have said would have been the right scale of the thing, so I said nothing. Then Cale Vorn Seth was beside me, not touching, just beside, in the way of a supervisor who has observed something she approves of and is choosing how to express that. Then two of the other long-term residents. Then Karath, who had given up pretending he was watching from a respectful distance and simply came to stand nearby, because he was 10 and this was not a situation that required him to be subtle about how he felt. And Ale, who crossed from her position by the door with the deliberate movement of someone executing a considered decision, and came to stand at my side in the corner chair angle, the position she occupied when she intended to stay. One by one, and not in a rush, and not in any formation, in the organic way that groups gather when the gathering is genuine and nothing is performing anything, the compound came to where I was standing. I was a man who had been sent here as a penalty. I had brought 2 reference binders and a framed notation chart, and the instruction I had followed for 14 years. I had read the ledgers. I had filed the correction. I had answered every question in full, and explained the full version instead of the simplified one, and stayed at my desk past 7, when I found something that needed finding, and done the accumulative quiet work that does not feel significant on any given day, and amounts to something real by the end of a month. The compound gathered around me with the quiet, complete attention of people who have decided where the still point of their room is, and moved toward it. Inspector Davsorn Kale from the doorway watched this happen. I met her eyes briefly across the common area. Her expression held the precise, controlled quality I had seen before, and behind it, the thing I had not tried to read too carefully when I first encountered it, and could now name. It was the satisfaction of an inspector who had filed 11 findings of deficiency over 4 years, and had come today expecting to file a 12th, and had instead found something she was going to file a different kind of report about entirely. She nodded once, with the small precision of someone making a notation. Then she turned and walked back through the corridor that was not quite gray and not quite green, and I did not watch her go because the people who were gathered around me were more important than the departure of someone who was leaving. I stayed. I had not applied for reassignment. The transfer order was technically open-ended, and I could have submitted a request once the staffing shortfall designation resolved. I had not submitted one. Cale Vorn Seth had not asked me whether I intended to. We had both, independently, reached the conclusion that some questions answer themselves if you leave them alone long enough. The reclassification recommendation would take months to process. The ledgers needed a full secondary review against the most recent procedural updates, which I had not yet had time to conduct properly. There were 3 jurisdictional updates in the past 18 months that I had cross-referenced in summary, but not in the full detail the case categories deserved. Ale had not yet reached the classification appeal section of the certification index. She was saving it, she had told me, because it was the most complex part, and she wanted to be ready for it. Karath had found what he believed was a discrepancy in one of the posted corridor notices, and his reasoning was mostly sound, and it deserved a careful look. I went back to my desk. Outside, in the corridor that was not quite gray and not quite green, the compound went on doing its work. The clearance tracking sheet had 23 marks on it. The framed chart held the same instruction it had held at every desk I had ever sat at. Somewhere in the common area, Ale was telling her mother something about the classification appeal section, why she was saving it, and what she planned to do when she got there. Some things you do because the ledger is in front of you, and you read what is in front of you, all of it, including the parts that look unimportant. Some things you stay for because the work is real, and the room is full of people who have learned to be careful about what they expect, and they are, cautiously, beginning to expect something different. I turn to the next page and read it.